It's Jeserich. This radio program airs throughout the Pacifica Radio Network, and it comes out of Pacifica station KPFA in Berkeley. KPFA was the first station from that network, and arguably the first listener-sponsored public radio station that was born in Berkeley in 1949, and it was created by pacifists, hence the word Pacifica. And these pacifists imagined the creation of such a radio station as they were being punished for their opposition to World War II. Well, today we're going to be in conversation about this pacifist movement during this time. It's a complicated issue as World War II is largely remembered as a necessary war, if not even the good war. My guest for this is Daniel Akst. Daniel Akst is a writer whose work has appeared in a number of publications. He's also a journalist. He's penned a number of books, and his latest, which we will be in conversation about, is called War by Other Means, The Pacifist of the Greatest Generation, who revolutionized resistance. David Akst, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm going to sort of begin maybe on the big picture here about these pacifists, because we hear about them. We've always heard about them in my radio network because they were the ones, some of them. It was a smaller group of a much larger movement that was occurring at the time. But we always hear about them because of the creation of this radio network that the show broadcasts from. But we don't hear oftentimes about the larger movement. And I just want to put it in perspective because I think an interesting argument you make is that it is these World War II pacifists, those who opposed going to war in Europe in the 1940s and probably late 1930s as well, because the war begins in Europe earlier. It is this movement that may not be well remembered today, but had a huge impact afterwards.
That's right. You know, I guess we should step back for a moment, and not many people remember that before Pearl Harbor and before World War II broke out, America had a massive national pacifist movement. It was inspired to a great degree by regret over what was then called the Great War. We had fought in Europe the war to end all wars. That became a kind of cynical locution a few years after it ended, because obviously it didn't succeed. And there was pacifism, particularly on American campuses. It was a diverse national movement, young women, minorities, all kinds of people. There were hearings in Congress, and people blamed the war on the munitions makers and their greed for profits. People blamed the war for all kinds of ills, including the Depression, the Spanish flu epidemic that killed so many Americans, young Americans in particular. And it was just a waste and a fraud in the popular mind. But as time went by, the rise of fascism in Europe, and finally the outbreak of war in September of 1939 in Europe made it increasingly clear to Americans that we might well be dragged into this, and nobody wanted it. But there were really two groups opposed to it. A group we now call, and some of them called themselves isolationists, and they were we can call them not anti-interventionists, really. And they held views that were very close to the views of most Americans today. Let's stay out of war and let's stay militarily strong in order to do so. We have an advantageous geographical position across the ocean from our potential antagonists.
This sounds like conservatives.
But not all were very conservative. They really spanned quite. They may have predominated in the heartland, but that was a position shared by absolutely millions of Americans. And others, of course, were pacifists. Pearl Harbor changed everything. And we already had been aiding Britain increasingly with the recognition that we had to sustain Britain. And after Pearl Harbor, opposition to the war all but collapsed. Most of the anti-interventionists, if they were military age, joined the armed forces. Many of the pacifists recognized there was no choice to fight. Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, and many others said, well, we are pacifists except when it comes to Hitler. And that's to say nothing of our assailants in the Pacific. So But there was a small hard core of pacifists, largely religious inspired, who believed that no matter what, violence was wrong, and they differed. Many of them. They had different views about what was violence, and Jesse Wallace Hugan, who founded the War Resisters League, uh, felt that war was the great evil. That didn't mean she shouldn't defend herself if attacked. She even justified assassination of Hitler if it could be brought about. Whereas other pacifists just barred any violence at all. And my book focuses on the absolutists who opposed all violence and who would not cooperate with the war effort in any possible way, and ended up either in civilian public service camps, which were these far-flung, dusty camps where there was supposed to be important work of irrigation and logging and other things, and some of that occurred, and pacifists who even refused that and went to prison because they would not subject themselves to conscription. And it turned out that in this process, in going through this war, they prepared themselves for the future. The government prepared them for the future by throwing them together in these institutions, by hardening them against prison and social disrepute and all of the difficulties, as you can imagine, that would go with that controversial stance at a time when the nation was under threat, under attack, and people's sons were off fighting in this terrible war. So that is the focus of my book.
A lot there I want to unpack. Let me take one at a time. The War Resisters League, is this something that comes out of the World War II era, or is this something that would come later? Because many of these folks would also be important in the in the war against the Vietnam War.
Absolutely. The War Resisters League actually was founded by Jesse Wallace Hugan in 1923, and so it was part of the interwar pacifist movement, and it really kind of sprang out of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. The Fellowship of Reconciliation was a Christian pacifist group, an offshoot of the British version, started in America, I think during World War I, but before we were in it. And then in 1923, after the Great War, the War Resisters League was a more secular version, home to many socialists, many Jewish pacifists, and in fact, there were a few Jewish pacifists who persisted in World War II, despite the growing knowledge of Hitler's crimes against the Jews. And I do give them some attention in the book. And so the War Resisters League after World War II became very important, in part because World War II pacifists kind of took it over and radicalized it even further. Men like David Dellinger, who was all his life quite a militant radical, played that role. So there were these two strains, even going back in American pacifism. And during World War II, the religiously inspired pacifists, and many of mine were in that category, I think they grew more secular. I think they were alienated in part by the support of all of the churches, organized religion, for the war effort. And so that was just one of the ways that they changed, and that the left changed in this moment in history. They became increasingly secular. David Dellinger, to focus again on him, was a very spiritual man almost all of his life. When he confronted World War II, he was a seminary student at the Union Theological Seminary, and he was entitled to a deferment just on that basis, but he wouldn't even fill out the card. And that was, he just thought that in itself was a kind of cooperation with the war effort, and complicity. And so he went to prison twice. So you see this growing secularization, and there are many more such changes that are visible in this moment in time in this particular group of people.
Tell me more about these camps. I mean, I think we understand what prison is, but these camps, I've heard them described. They obviously weren't Japanese American internment camps of World War II, but I have heard them described as also their own form of internment.
Yeah, good question. So that enables us to, let's see. In 1940, the nation got its first peacetime draft, and everyone the Roosevelt administration, the peace churches such as the Quakers and the Mennonites and so on, everyone understood we didn't want a repeat of World War I when there had been kind of abuse of conscientious objectors. There are people who, as a matter of conscience, do not believe in going to war, and something should be done to accommodate them without unduly, disadvantaging people who will go and fight.
The country had not forgot that Eugene Victor Debs ran for president from a jail cell because of his opposition to World War I.
Right. So there was a whole, that's right, there's a whole history there. So to their credit, all sides said, look, we should make it better. And they did. They made special and reasonable, in my view, provisions for conscientious objectors. They said you had to go before your local draft board. Everything was distributed. It was America, thousands of local draft boards. And you had to tell them that you were a conscientious objector. You had to be, a part of some, you had to have a religious basis for your objection and so on. And if you were approved as a CO, you had some choices. You could go into the armed forces, perhaps as a medic or in some other non-combat role. And if you didn't want to do that, you could go to one of what they called civilian public service camps, many of them on the site of these conservation corps camps from the Depression. And there was going to be work of national importance, supposedly. And there was some. Also, these men, by the way, later volunteered in all kinds of extremely dangerous and important experiments with they allowed themselves to be infected with hepatitis and allowed themselves to be starved. Anyway, these camps were all over the country. And these camps, eventually the men in these camps soured on them. They were unpaid. There was no pay for the camps. The government didn't want to. There were various reasons for that. And the churches supported the camps as best they could. But one role that the camps played was as kind of hotbeds of radicalism, of crucibles. And these people were thrown together from all over the country. Some of them were anarchists, some of them were socialists, some of them were kind of Christian pacifists. And they talked and they debated and they held classes and they had visits from people like Bayard Rustin, who would give them lectures, and a variety of other people. They started newsletters. They created art. It was an incredibly vibrant world, and yet a depressing one for the men because they were not paid. They increasingly saw the work they were given as pointless, and a spirit of ever greater radicalism began to take hold in these camps. And some men started walking away, and many started blaming the peace churches for a form of complicity running these camps on behalf of the government. By the way, they were founded with all kinds of utopian ideals, and unfortunately, as so often the case, it ended in tears.
The idea of the radio station I work at, KPFA, came from one of these camps.
There was a man named Lou Hill who was in the camp at Colville. It was called the Colville Camp in the Sierra Nevada, close to the Nevada border, as I recall, and he associated with some other pacifists, Roy Kepler, Roy Finch, and another group, and some others. I haven't become an expert on this, but it is in the book in brief. And out of this grew this remarkable Pacifica Foundation and network, and really public radio before there was public radio, listener-supported radio before there was, NPR that we all know today. Yeah. And it's just one of the many, pacifists.
Were people allowed to leave these camps?
So you were not. They weren't prisons, and you could go into town on your night off and see a movie and whatever, and you got some furloughs. So the prisons had several functions. I mean, the administration understood. I mean, you didn't want these guys just sort of lolling around, or as they would be perceived to be when everyone had their sons, jumping out of airplanes and landing on beaches, and we didn't, that wasn't really good for anybody, and similarly, it was felt that the pacifists themselves, at least the peace churches and many of the young men, I think they were against war, but they wanted to make a contribution to society. Many of them also had a profound desire to demonstrate their courage. People called them cowards, and they denied that. And in fact, they weren't largely cowards. They volunteered. It took a lot of courage to do what they did, And as we'll discuss, they took a lot of positions that were unpopular in society, that were courageous, and they volunteered for some of these extremely dangerous experiments. A number of them also served as smoke jumpers to put out very dangerously forest fires in the West. And the thousands volunteered to work in mental institutions, which at the time were this Dickensian archipelago of custodial facilities with very little treatment, little funding, violent staff, inadequate clothing and food, and just a horror show. And the pacifists, when they came in, really, at least for a while, changed things, not only changed things to the extent they could, but drew public attention through media exposés to this. They started a newsletter. Of course, they were always publishing something, and they started a newsletter to circulate best practices to one another. They had no particular training, but then again, neither had the regular staff, which had gone off to work in the more lucrative war factories or even into the armed forces. So there was just a whole variety of things they did that were, I mean, in some cases you would be a conscientious objector locked in a ward with hundreds alone at night with hundreds of people suffering mental illness, a number of them dangerous. And you're on your own, and you're unarmed, and you don't want to use arms. And it was an interesting experience in itself, because many pacifists discovered that while they wouldn't use violence, there were times when you had to use force, and we would call it restraining force,
such as
or holding.
Give me an example.
For example, a resident of one of these facilities might be attacking another resident, or even a CO with a chair or something, and you had to hold that man down. But that didn't mean you had to beat the daylights out of him with a stick, as had been done in some cases by the staff that had preceded the pacifists.
When you say CO, you mean conscientious objector.
Yes.
And did somebody write about this later? Talk about this later?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on it, and there was one young man in particular whose letters home formed the basis of I think a fascinating chapter about this, where his discovery of just what was going on in these awful facilities, the ways in which nonviolence could play an important role in helping to maintain the peace and give some dignity to the people who were stuck in these places. Obviously, the pacifists who were working on staff suddenly in these facilities didn't control the funding and the food and so on, and the supply of clothing even was short. But they did what they could, and they were earnest, and they were serious about it, and they recognized that, it's just not serving any purpose to allow someone to club you to death there in the middle of the floor. There were other contexts where pacifists did take blows passively, Bayard Rustin and David Dellinger and others. But while they were in these camps, in that instance, I'm talking about in prison and after. So for many of the pacifists, opportunities to do these things I described, smoke jumping and working with the mentally ill, were more interesting and meaningful and dangerous and challenging, and enabled them to feel that they themselves had courage and were not merely shirking combat, which obviously is a terrifying experience. And they were at least doing something dangerous and challenging to make society better.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation today about the pacifists during the World War II era. My guest for this is Daniel Akst. Daniel Akst is the author of the book, War by Other Means, The Pacifist of the Greatest Generation, who revolutionized resistance. Who revolutionized resistance. I think this is what you're starting to get at here when you talk about what happened to these folks in the camps and then what would come, afterwards?
Yes. What happened was pacifism, had been a largely religious thing in America, and had seen itself as a matter of a more passive kind of thing, of standing aside. There had been difficulty going all the way back, say, to the Civil War, when Quakers and other pacifists opposed slavery. Well, we went to war to stop slavery. What do you do now? Well, William Lloyd Garrison, the great firebrand abolitionist, did not support the Union cause. Really, did not. He kind of stood aside from the whole thing, and that really affected his influence in the abolitionist movement. And so, fast forward, everyone knew we were fighting a terrible, evil adversary, certainly in Europe. And in Japan, there had been, obviously terrible abuses perpetrated on the Chinese, and on others in the Pacific, on American prisoners, and so forth. So it wasn't a matter of that, but in any case, the pacifists, American pacifists during World War II, really started to transform what had been a more passive resistance movement into an active movement for rectifying injustices that had been long festering in society. And I think on that note, it's important to recognize that when war broke out, the small, hard core of remaining pacifists recognized they weren't going to stop the war. And in fact, overt efforts in that direction might lead to suppression by the government anyway. So there was really nothing there for them. And most people supported the war, and churches supported the war. Labor supported the war. Now, this stuff is important because we can see right here already the beginnings of the divorce between the working class and the left. After the Depression, the sufferings of the Depression, the war brought a tremendous number of well-paid jobs to working class Americans, including some that had been marginalized. Black Americans could get factory jobs to a great extent. They suffered discrimination, but it was better. And their sons, and in some cases daughters, were in the armed forces. And so just as the pacifists became more secular, they also turned away from the kind of working class and redistributive orientation that they had, and they looked to America's moral Achilles heel, which was the treatment of Black Americans. And during the war, Gunnar Myrdal published An American Dilemma. He had surveyed the racial landscape in America, and he pointed out in the book that most white Americans knew that the treatment of Black Americans was wrong. They were sheepish about it. They were embarrassed by it. And the pacifists during the war really turned more strongly in that direction. And so we see there the orientation away from redistribution and toward race. And at that time, really a terribly important issue in particular. We had even the armed forces that were supposedly fighting for freedom and justice were segregated. The role of Blacks was limited. This was a terrible, terrible source of resentment for Black Americans, that they were denied a full role in this central function of citizenship at that time, male citizenship, which was service in the armed forces.
Civil rights.
Blacks who served.
Civil rights icon, yeah. Civil rights icon Bayard Rustin is a part of this pacifist movement in the 1940s.
Yes, I focus on four individuals: Bayard Rustin, David Dellinger, Dorothy Day, and Dwight McDonald. And Rustin, his whole focus, he would never accept he was Black and he was also gay. And that's why his writings are entitled Time on Two Crosses. And Rustin and James Farmer was another one who was a pacifist during World War II. And there was a complex founding, but Farmer and white pacifists and Rustin were involved in the founding of what later became CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, a very important organization in the civil rights movement afterwards. They started in Chicago, in the local neighborhoods on the South Side, with housing, with restaurants. And so there was this turn to what we now call the civil rights movement, and there was similarly the pacifists played, I think, a very important role in calling the nation to conscience in terms of the war. They said, the bombing of civilians is just as wrong when we do it as when our enemies did it, and we condemned it when they did it. The internment of Japanese Americans from the West Coast into dusty camps far from home was terribly wrong, and we shouldn't do it, and certainly not on the basis of the fact that they just happen to be of a certain ethnicity. Um, they upheld freedom of speech during the war. They insisted, of course, on equality for Black Americans, and there was a long way to go there. And they warned earlier than most people of the mass killing of Jews in Europe by Hitler's forces, and loudly requested or argued that more Jews should be permitted to enter the European Jews should be permitted to enter the United States as refugees to escape Hitler's predations and depredations. And Jesse Wallace Hugen and others attacked the principle of unconditional surrender, which the Allies had agreed to. Their argument was, well, gee, they're just going to, fight to the bitter end. You could save many lives with some sort of negotiated peace. You might save millions of Jews because victory doesn't bring back dead men and women.
So they thought they could save people by negotiating for peace and ending the war sooner rather than prolonging it.
Yes, and it's hard to know what that would look like. I mean, look, there's what would we let Hitler keep France? I mean, would we let Hitler remain in power? Would Stalin go along? I mean, there's a lot of problems potentially here. But let's look at the other side of it. Just before Pearl Harbor, many Americans, liberal conservatives both, said, well, gee, why is it so terrible for Hitler to invade France or Poland, but it's okay for France to occupy North Africa and Indochina? Why is it okay for Britain to rule over India and much of Africa, yet wrong for the Nazis to seek to invade the British Isles? How about Britain and Ireland? This was not just fringe stuff. This was talked about on the floor of Congress, So I think eventually people came to see that, as bad as colonialism was, in fact, funny thing is the war ended it in effect, but that there was really no choice but to support Britain and finally go to war. And I should emphasize, people ask me this all the time, I am not a pacifist. And I say in the book, I don't think that my pacifists made the right choice with respect to World War II. But I do think they were right about an awful lot of other things. And if one's instinctive response to war is to say no, well, probably 99% of the time that's correct. So
tell me their reasoning, how they intellectually, created a framework and maybe spiritually, emotionally, how they approached World War II, what has been called the necessary war. It's been called the good war. Tell me how they framed their opposition to this war. I mean, there is something behind it. It doesn't come out of some void.
That is correct, but that doesn't mean that it was coherent or persuasive. They had a variety of approaches. For many of them, it was sheerly religious. It was simply that thou shalt not. This is it's the Sermon on the Mount. It's thou shalt not kill, and that's just the end of it. And for many of them, it was this idea of equivalence. There was for a while, this again. Well, I mean, Britain has this vast colonial empire now, and all this is imperialists fighting one another, And some of them said, oh, it's just capitalists kind of fighting one another. Dwight MacDonald for a while argued that there would be no peace until we had the socialist revolution or something. They told themselves stories that nonviolence could. They told the story of some Danish village where supposedly children with flowers or something had flummoxed invading Nazis, and they had turned around or turned back. I mean, all of these kind of fairy tales would rise up. They didn't have the reason people, even pacifists, most of them gave up is there just wasn't much alternative. There were, by the way, not just pacifists, but more conservative opponents of the war, even after, even later. And there was a feeling, we had the oceans and so forth. So there wasn't a great coherent framework that they shared, that they had for staying out of this war, particularly after an attack on American soil, which sank the Legacy Navy and killed something like 3,000 Americans in and around Pearl Harbor. And so I make no attempt to justify them on that basis. However,
yeah, I'm not trying to get you to justify them. I'm just trying to figure out what they were saying, what they thought about this, what their approach was.
Yes, I think that they went, I quote John Dewey in the book. I mean, I think that there was this sense of we should really look to ourselves and get our own house in order, our own moral house in order. We should end the imperialist system, which was at the base of the war, a fight over the spoils of resources internationally. We should bring everyone to the negotiating table. We should try these various things. Nonviolence is a very effective technique to bring about change, as Gandhi demonstrated, when one particular circumstance prevails, and that is that your antagonist has or wants to believe they have scruples. Your antagonist sees your humanity at some level. If you don't have that, your antagonist will simply shoot you. And I think our pacifists would have been the first on the list to be gunned down if we had been subject to some sort of fascist invasion or something. And Gandhi, I doubt, would have pursued pacifism under, circumstances where there was a different antagonist, although his comments about the Nazis and the Jews demonstrate a certain amount of delusion on his part. He said, the Jews should have just hurled themselves from cliffs and so on. And it's absolutism of any kind is very difficult to sustain. And that's true of absolute nonviolence as much as anything else.
You say even if you thought they were wrong about this, they were right afterwards. I think of somebody you mentioned earlier. Maybe tell me a little bit more about him, David Dellinger. You begin your book with David Dellinger, actually not in World War II, which he was a pacifist in World War II, as you mentioned, and I think he went to jail. But he was also part of the Chicago 7 trial.
Yes.
In the Vietnam era.
Yes. David Dellinger is a fascinating figure. And before he was part of the Chicago 7, which was charged with conspiracy and so forth for their protests at the Democratic National Convention, I guess it was in 1968, he was part of something that was known as the Union 8. And these were 8 young men at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. They were training to become Protestant clergymen. And they, when the first peacetime draft was adopted and they had to register in October of 1940, they refused to register, even though by registering they would be exempt because they were seminary students. And at some level, if you step back, there's a certain vanity to this. I can't sully myself by filling out the card in order to avail myself of the provision established by really perfectly decent people on all sides of this to allow objectors an out. And they felt, on the other hand, they had a certain argument. They said, why should seminarians receive a special exemption from this thing that is wrong no matter who does it? And so they were really the first ones, and they made national headline. It was on the front page of the New York Times and so on. And they were sent to prison. That was Dellinger's first stint in prison, and he did more prison time later in the war. They threw him in prison twice for refusing to be drafted. So he had a history with all of this. And by the time he was in the Chicago 7, he was an extremely experienced, thoughtful, and hardened veteran of resistance. And the world came around to these pacifists because Americans, after their initial support, turned against the Vietnam War to a large extent as it dragged on. And there was a group at that time who knew all about opposing a war, and here they were.
And they saw a future after World War II of more militarism at the time.
Their vision in many respects of the future was pretty accurate. I mean, they understood that there was the need to grant blacks full rights, full equality. They said that, well, World War II would. They feared World War II would give us tyranny. It didn't really do that, but they feared that it would permanently militarize the United States, which had always had a small army, tiny armed forces, and they were right about that. Before Eisenhower coined the term military-industrial complex, they in effect said that's where we're going, and he confirmed it as early as the 1950s. So they opposed Dorothy Day, organized the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, famous and growing protests year after year against nuclear preparedness drills, which she said were a complete waste of time. And they opposed nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation. They opposed colonialism, which fell apart after World War II. Europe could not hold on to its colonies, thankfully. And so, and then of course, when the Vietnam War happened, they were against it from the first minute, when hardly anybody else was. Even Korea, they opposed. So they were consistent, and they were right about a lot of things. I mean, in a way, the civil rights movement, after all, gave us helped to bring about the women's liberation movement and the rise of gay rights. And Dwight McDonald, a pacifist during the war, published a little magazine called Politics, where he talked about these things years before most people were doing so. So really, and of course, in the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin played a crucial role, if behind the scenes, in making sure that the movement was nonviolent, no matter how much violence it encountered. And I think that was a crucial aspect of its success.
Daniel Akst is our guest, and he joins us for a conversation about his book, War by Other Means, The Pacifists of the Greatest Generation Who Revolutionized Resistance. I'd like to come back to the religious roots of this pacifist movement during the World War II era. And I think the religious roots are important because, in the end, there is no good war. There is no necessary war, because they would write, and I take this from your book, war is an evil because it is violation of the way of love as seen in God through Christ. Talk to me about the theological aspects of this movement.
Well, you're right. That was the basis of it. And even as they grew more secular, I think many of them never lost their essential spirituality, and as they moved away from organized religion, humanity itself became the focus of their spiritual motivation, their spiritual yearnings. They believed that there was a sacredness to the person, and by the same token, as they became more secular, maybe nature abhors a vacuum in this department. And when there's so many ways in which today's left reflects changes we saw among the pacifists of World War II.
Today, moving away from religion.
Yeah, not only, but yet substituting something else. I mean, there is a kind of a religious character to progressive today. There's a kind of at times there's a special language, and there's a kind of dogma that prevails, and it becomes a central focus. Heretics are expelled. We use the word canceled. All of these things. None of these pacifists would have believed in that stuff. They believed in persuading one's antagonists. They believed in reason and persuasion and inclusion in a much more radical way than their descendants. But by the same token, we also see the alienation from the working class. We see the focus on identity, and we see the importance of women who really were a force in pacifism between the wars, and who are an ever greater force culturally and politically today. And we see the emphasis on direct action, on protests, on sit down, which they took from organized labor to some extent, brought into the civil rights movement, but at the cost, perhaps, of democratic activity, of political organizing. we see the obsessive concern with egalitarianism and consensus. And so we also see the dysfunction that has taken hold in many progressive organizations today. I mean, Dellinger, people don't realize that we call them radicals, just like today's radicals, but my radicals in many ways were libertarians, if not anarchists. And David Dellinger, after the war, founded the Libertarian Press, it was called, and Liberation Magazine. They were free speech zealots, civil liberties zealots. A.J. Muste, the great pacifist, his first biographer was Nat Hentoff, who was a great civil libertarian. So we can see many aspects of today's left, incipient, good, bad, indifferent, in the transformations of American radicalism that that our pacifists went through as a result of the crucible of war.
Tell me more about Reverend A.J. Muste. You just mentioned him.
Yeah. A.J. Muste is a great American and a fascinating figure. He early on was he was a Marxist for all. He became very big in organized labor, led brutal strikes in the early part of the 20th century were brutal. I mean, it was a matter of life and death. Workers could starve. The violence of the state often was enlisted by employers against workers. There was no social safety net to speak of. And Muste, through various permutations, returned to Christian pacifism. He had been, like a number of the figures in my book, he'd been trained as a minister. In his case, I believe in the Dutch Reformed Church, as I recall. And he was our leading pacifist, and he made the decision to devote. First of all, he hired Bayard Rustin, he hired James Farmer, and he loaned them out to A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement, and he loaned them out to focus on the Congress of Racial Equality and for civil rights. And so he played this crucial and little-known role in fostering an organized civil rights movement in the United States long before the 1960s. He did in the 1940s, and he was a man of tremendous energy, and he was a father figure to Bayard Rustin, and tried to cope with Rustin's the problems that arose from Rustin's life as what we would call today a gay man. Long before Rustin's famous arrest in Pasadena in the 1950s, which forced him into the background in the civil rights movement, Rustin got into the same sort of trouble leading a prison strike in a federal prison in Kentucky. The federal prisons were all, even in the North, segregated in those days, and the pacifists tried to desegregate them, and they succeeded in a number of them. They had other complaints about mail and so forth, but Rustin was leading this effort in this prison, and it emerged that he had solicited sex with several men. He'd had sex with some men, and he denied it, which was an unusual thing for him. He ever after would be he didn't do things like that, and he denied it, and it destroyed his credibility there, and tried Muste's patience. And later, in the 50s, early 50s, as a result of the Pasadena arrest, Muste cut him loose. And so we see, again, so many of the concerns of modern radicals and the difficulties echoed in this time.
With the pacifist movement during the 1940s, are there anti-war marches? Are there gatherings? Is it a cohesive movement? Is it at all centralized? Is it connected? Is it disparate? How would you describe this in the 40s during the war itself?
During the war itself,
and even before, yeah.
Yeah, well, during the war, there were the things that you described, but they were tiny and they were insignificant. Many of the people who would have done these things were in prison or in the armed forces serving as medics or in some other non-violent capacity. And again, they understood that there wasn't a lot of point to it, Before the war, there were massive marches, particularly of students, rallies, marches on Washington. In terms of organization, the two main groups were the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the War Resisters League. And the Fellowship in particular saw its membership bloom, paradoxically, after Pearl Harbor. Now, one reason was that membership in the Fellowship of Reconciliation could be helpful when you went before your draft board and said, I am a conscientious objector. Look, I'm a card carrying member of this famous, of the leading religious pacifist group, because you had to be religious, as the basis for your objection. But also, I think that, and this is important, I think that after Pearl Harbor, pacifists were marginalized and they were radicalized and they became a counterculture. They became much smaller in number, but they became in some ways a purer, more fervent group, and they were marginalized. As a counterculture, you can do certain things. It's liberating at some level. A lot of change, I think, comes from the fringes, and that's where they found themselves. And it wasn't easy, but they learned to be comfortable there, and it served them well in traversing the what might be called the longueurs of the 50s, and when they finally got into the 60s.
How about any connection to the beatniks?
Some in that movement were pacifists, had been conscientious objectors, I think that all of the subsequent counterculture in some ways owes something to the pacifists. In fact, there were quite a number of poets, Kenneth Rexroth, Kenneth Patchen, quite a number of poets who were pacifists. Some were anti-war, not pacifists. Robert Lowell went to prison rather than go to war. I think that just as at one time socialism had been de rigueur for a creative person in the Anglophone world, pacifism today is almost a given for many young radicals, creative people. It's almost a reflexive thing. And again, you might say it's a fair weather pacifism. When Russia invaded Ukraine, a great many people who considered themselves anti-war in all circumstances started to see a different side of things.
I was going to bring that up because there are anti-war activists today who are against the war, who are against the United States sending billions and billions and billions of dollars of weapons to Russia. To Ukraine.
Yeah.
That and this piqued my interest when you said in World War II, the pacifists thought that if you could bring an end to the war earlier, you could save more lives, including Jewish lives. We do have anti-war activists today who say what we need to do is get to a peace agreement. This is only prolonging the war. And as you said, it's kind of split the left, because there are those on the left who see Russia as the aggressor who has invaded a country, and Ukraine has the right to defend itself. And then you still have anti-war. I think of people like Medea Benjamin would be an example, a longtime anti-war activist. And when I think about these activists, I do think about the pacifist of World War II, who are also going against what was still today by many people seen as a necessary or even a good war.
Absolutely. Look, there are no easy answers about these matters, except perhaps to adopt a default position of opposing war unless we find, and Ukraine may be an example. I mean, if it was Brooklyn that was being invaded, we may take a different view, and that's perfectly fine.
I don't think these people would.
And that's right. And neither did my pacifists. So it's a difficult
conviction. It's a conviction. It is a life conviction. I am against war.
And that is what I wrote about. And George Orwell had a very harsh answer to pacifists, largely British pacifists, saying that your protests and your purity depends on seamen giving their lives to bring food and supplies and, yes, weapons to Britain. And without the willingness of some to fight and kill and lose their lives, you would have no ability to protest and might not exist. And so there are just no easy answers to these matters, and I think that I give the last word in the book to Hannah Arendt, who says it's all too easy when we choose a necessary evil, as we so often must, to forget that we're still doing evil.
Daniel Akst has been our guest. Again, he has joined us to talk about the pacifist movement of the World War II generation. He is the author of the book, War by Other Means, The Pacifists of the Greatest Generation Who Revolutionized Resistance. Daniel Akst, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Mitch, it's been a complete pleasure on my part. Thank you so much for having me.